Hey guys, I'm Georgia and welcome back for another episode in my history series, where today we're taking a look at yet another awesome woman from history. This has become somewhat of its own series within a series on my channel, so I've actually now made a playlist in which you'll find all of my biographical accounts of incredible badass women who fought the good fight. I'll leave it linked down below in case you want to go watch the rest of the videos in this little mini series. Today the subject of our biography is Nellie Bly, someone who is often credited with being the mother of modern journalism, the best reporter of all time. She changed the face of journalism forever in a time when many people thought she shouldn't even be able to write, let alone have such a huge voice. She was the epitome of someone who refused to give up, who refused to be silenced. She had a lot of things to say and you were going to listen. Nellie Bly is perhaps most well known for an expose she wrote on the treatment of patients within mental asylums, which led to a whole lot of change, or perhaps for her record-breaking trip around the world in just 72 days. If Nellie Bly said she could do something, then nothing was going to get in her way. But just a couple of exciting things before I get into the rest of this video. You may have noticed, if you're watching this in video form, that I am not in my usual filming space. I have finally bought my own house. Me and Holly have bought a house. This is it. I know you're probably thinking, Georgia, you've moved house so much in the last couple of years. I know, I feel you. I'm tired too, but we're finally in our home. This is gonna be our home for the foreseeable future, for the next few years at the very least. So no more moving house, I'm pleased to announce. I've been saving up to buy a house for like 7 years, so to finally actually own a house, it's just the biggest accomplishment of my entire life. We started the process at the beginning of last June. We found what we thought was our dream house. It went to shit, it all fell through. The seller was just a horrible man, but we'd already given up the rent on our flats by the time that fell through. So we had to move back in with Holly's parents, and now we're here, finally, and I'm just so happy. If it's a little bit echoey, I do apologise to my podcast listeners, that's probably really annoying, but I simply don't have much furniture yet. We had to sell loads of our furniture when we moved out of the flat because we just didn't have anywhere to store it, and pretty much the only thing we kept is this lovely sofa. So yeah, apologies if my background changes in little videos over the coming weeks, and I'm just trying to figure out where's best to film. It definitely won't be in here. This is currently in the lounge, but it's just the only place I have. Also the only place there aren't boxes stacked up against the walls, so we'll get there. It's so exciting. If you want to keep up to date on the sort of decorating journey, we're gonna renovate a lot of this house, then feel free to follow me over on Instagram. I'll put that down below if you care about that kind of thing. Yeah, it's really exciting. I feel like it's something I've worked towards for a really long time, and to finally be in my own house is crazy. How am I old enough to own my own house? It's insane. It's so exciting. But before I tell you all about Nellie Bly, I want to share the sponsor of this week's video with you, Casetify. Casetify create the most amazing phone cases and are on a mission towards sustainability, working to eliminate virgin and single-use plastic without ever compromising quality. Casetify's new impact and ultra impact cases are made of 65% recycled and plant-based materials, as well as them being delivered in 100% recycled packaging. And not only that, the impact and ultra impact cases aligned with Casetify's Chi-Tech 2.0 technology, an impact absorbing material made to protect your phone from drops up to 9.8 feet. This has been a lifesaver for me because I have ponies. My phone is always falling out of my pocket as I ride or as I'm wading through the mud, and it's still very much in one piece. Last week, my pony literally grabbed it out of my pocket with his teeth and threw it into his water bucket, and we survived, thank God. My heart did stop for a little moment. The shock dispersing material is lined inside the case bumper, meaning that all four corners of your phone are protected, and it's still only 13mm thin, so style isn't compromised, the cases aren't heavy or bulky. Casetify have dared me to drop the phone and put their protection to the test, so I'm going to do that. I do have a lot of faith in them. If my phone can survive my pony, then it can survive a little fall. Hopefully that's not famous last words, but you'll see how it survives without a single scratch. The cases are also wireless charging and 5G compatible and feature Densify, an antimicrobial coating that kills 99% of bacteria by preventing the growth of microbes and preventing them from sticking to the surface in the first place. How is that even possible from a phone case? I love technology. Casetify is all about protection and personality. There are endless print options with Casetify, with phone case designs and colours to fit your every mood. Or you can personalise your own case with something truly custom. I love scrolling through the website to find new designs that I love. If you want to get your very own Casetify case, you can go to casetify.com/GeorgiaMarie to get 15% off your order, and let me know which one you choose. Inspire me for my next choice. So Nellie Bly was born on the 5th of May 1864 in Cochrane's Mills, Pennsylvania, a town founded by her very own father, Judge Michael Cochrane. Because Nellie Bly wasn't born as Nellie Bly, that name is a pseudonym. She was born as Elizabeth Cochrane. For the sake of this video though, I'll just refer to her as Nellie throughout, but she took on the pen name when she started writing professionally in adulthood. The Cochrane family lived very comfortably in their self-named hometown. Michael had been married before and had 10 children with his first wife, and then when he got with Mary Jane Kennedy, Nellie's mother, he had 5 more. Nellie was one of 15 children, so she had to learn from a young age how to speak up and how to get noticed. She took to wearing bright pink clothes to stand out from the crowd and earned herself the nickname Pinky because of this. Her father sadly died when she was just 6 years old, so her mother had to remarry, and that second marriage was not a good one. When he died, Michael's great wealth had to be split between all of his children and his wife, meaning that they were left with only a fraction of the money they had beforehand, so Mary was pretty much just forced to marry whoever she could to help provide. The abuse was so severe throughout the marriage though that it just wasn't worth it. Not long after, she left her second husband and the family relocated to Pittsburgh. Nellie knew from a young age that she was going to have to support herself in life. After seeing the horror of her mother's second marriage, she knew that she never ever wanted to have to rely on a man to get by. She was going to be successful by her own merits. At 15 years old, she enrolled at the State Normal School in Indiana, Pennsylvania, where she planned to train to become a teacher, one of the only professions considered suitable for a woman at this time. However, after a year and a half, she could no longer afford the tuition fees and so moved back to Pittsburgh to help her mother, who was running a boarding home at the time. A couple of years later, in 1855, Nellie read an article in the Pittsburgh Dispatch that spoke down on women. It argued that the only place a woman belonged was in the home, to be a helpmate to a man. It said they had no value outside of this, and Nellie, along with many other women I assume, was furious. She sent a very angry letter to the editor, George A. Madden, under the anonymous name Lonely Orphan Girl. George Madden was so impressed with this letter that he published a note in the next issue asking for Lonely Orphan Girl to come forward, and Nellie did so, marching into the Dispatch offices. She was offered a job as a columnist on the spot, a trial run at first, but that soon proved so popular that it was made into a permanent position. It was at this point that she adopted her pen name, Nellie Bly, after a popular song at the time by Stephen Foster. Nellie wasn't about to gently ease herself into the world of journalism. She was immediately full steam ahead and decided to write a series of investigative articles on female factory workers going undercover. Soon, the newspaper was receiving all kinds of complaints from men, mostly factory owners, saying that her writing was damaging business, and so her boss relegated her to the women's pages, where she had to write about fashion and society. This wasn't going to fly with Nellie Bly, and she kicked up a fuss. At only 21 years old, she was sent to Mexico to become a foreign correspondent, just basically getting her out of their hair. She spent 6 months in Mexico writing about the lives and customs of the Mexican people, but soon got herself in a sticky situation when she started protesting the imprisonment of another journalist who had been criticising the Mexican government. When the government started threatening her arrest as well, she quickly got out of there and headed back home, but they immediately just put her back in the society columns. Having none of it, Nellie quit and moved to New York. She was jobless for quite a few months when she first arrived in the city, with no publication wanting to hire a female journalist. But eventually one day she walked into the offices of the New York World and was offered a job. It was here that she would be given the job that would change the course of her career, when on the 22nd of September 1887, the managing editor John Cockrell challenged her to go undercover in a women's insane asylum of the time. She was to go to Blackwell Island Insane Asylum and write about her experience. They said, "We do not ask you to go there for the purpose of making sensational revelations. Write things up as you find them, good or bad. Give praise or blame as you think best, and the truth all the time." This was exactly the kind of challenge Nellie had been after, and immediately agreed, dedicating herself to her craft. She came up with a plan and practiced how to feign insanity in the mirror for a few days. She had concerns as to how she would get out of the asylum once she was in. Her editor said, "I do not know, but we will get you out if we have to tell who you are and for what purpose you feigned insanity." He told her to only worry about getting in. Nellie decided to take on the name Nellie Brown for the purpose of her investigation, and decided that first she needed to check herself into a boarding home so she would be around enough strangers for long enough that they would be able to deem her as insane. The boarding house she chose for her mission was a temporary home for females, where she slowly set about her mission after checking in for the night. It all started when a woman and assistant matron came up to her and asked, "What is wrong with you? Have you some sorrow or trouble?" Nellie said, "No, why?" Mrs. Stannard, the woman, replied, "I can see it in your face. It tells the story of a great trouble." Taking a chance, Nellie replied, "Yes, everything is so sad," in a haphazard way that she writes intended to reflect her craziness. It really did not take much for anyone to consider a woman insane back in the 1800s. If you do want to read the whole article Nellie wrote about her experience, by the way, I will have it linked in the description box down below. Over the course of the conversation with Mrs. Stannard, the matron, Nellie spoke about how everything was sad, how she didn't get any work, and how all the women in the boarding house looked horrible and crazy to her. She told her that she was scared of them. Mrs. Stannard assured her that they did not keep crazy people in the boarding house, and Nellie had set the stage. From there, she went round telling all the other women in the boarding house that everyone looked crazy, until eventually a maid made her go to bed. It took some persuading, with Nellie refusing to go to her room, until eventually she did. Her roommate was a woman called Mrs. Kane, who would be one of the few heroes in this story. Nellie would later write that no one else wanted to stay in her room with her because they had already deemed her as the crazy one, but Mrs. Kane didn't mind. She checked in on Nellie throughout the night, remaining with her in case that she needed to administer aid. Mrs. Kane smoothed her hair and talked to her as if she would talk to a child. She wrapped a blanket around her and just supported her. Nellie wrote that she felt terrible for pulling the wool over Mrs. Kane's eyes, but it was for the greater good. Nellie didn't sleep at all that night in the boarding house. This did add to the illusion of crazy in the rest of the women's eyes, but it was a purposeful choice on Nellie's part. She was concerned that if she fell asleep and slept soundly all night, no one would believe that she wasn't sane. So instead, she stared vacantly at the wall all night. As Nellie would later write, "That was the greatest night of my existence. For a few hours I stood face to face with self." It's interesting to me how easy it was to convince other people that you were insane back in these times. I have no doubt that if I were a Victorian woman in these times, I would have already been sent to an asylum, considering my terrible anxiety and my panic attacks. And I consider myself pretty competent in dealing with it. I'm sure I would have been shipped off. Not long after everyone had woken the next morning, somebody at the boarding house had already gone to fetch police officers to take Nellie away. She told the officers that she'd lost her trunks and she was looking for them, and that she didn't know where she'd come from. They told her if she followed them, if she came with them, they'd help her find her trunks, but soon she was hauled in front of a judge. The judge was fairly merciful, saying that Nellie reminded him of his dead sister, and he actually didn't seem too keen on sending her to an asylum, which of course is the opposite of what Nellie wanted. She had to amp up the odd behaviour a little bit in front of him until she was put in front of a doctor who declared that she'd been taking drugs, and she was subsequently put in an ambulance. As she was taken away, people stared and the neighbourhood children ran after them, determined to get a glimpse of the crazy woman. Once she reached what I suppose we'll call the intake building, Nellie was kept overnight. She was fed very little and underwent another doctor's exam, where she says the doctor only asked her a few questions, nothing to do with her mental health, made her stretch out her arms and move her fingers, to which he declared her case was hopeless. She also says she spoke to other women who seemed just as sane as her whilst in this intake building. No one seemed like they belonged there. But mission accomplished. Nellie was committed to Blackwell's asylum, sent over to the island on a boat. She didn't know what she was expecting once she got through the asylum doors, but she definitely wasn't expecting what she did find. Before she'd even walked through the doors, she'd had an enlightening conversation with another woman on the journey. Nellie asked her where they were, to which the woman, Miss Tilly Maynard, replied, "At the Blackwell's lunatic asylum." "Are you crazy?" Nellie asked. "No," Tilly replied, "but as we have been sent here, we will have to be quiet until we find some means of escape. They will be few though, if all the doctors, as Dr. Field, refuse to listen to me or give me a chance to prove my sanity." Now it was time for Nellie to get to work, judging life inside the asylum. She remembered the orders her editor had given her. Report things as you see them, there's no bias to be had, just report honestly what happens. Nellie had no angle here, she just needed to see life inside the asylum. The very first thing she noted was the poor treatment of the women, including herself. They were stripped down to thin layers of clothing and made to stand out in the cold. They were given orders, they were pushed, they were shoved and slapped if they weren't deemed to be following these orders properly. The food they were given for dinner was disgusting, the bread and butter inedible, given these horrible prunes and this weak tea. After dinner, it was bath time and she was undressed against her will in full view of everyone, made to get in an ice-cold bathtub and scrubbed by a staff member. Buckets of ice-cold water were thrown over her head, and then she was put into hospital clothes, a short flannel slip labelled lunatic asylum. Interestingly, Nellie gave up her act of insanity almost as soon as she entered Blackwell. It took mere moments for her to realise that it no longer mattered if she was insane or not. She was going to be deemed as so regardless. The patients who genuinely were sick, physically or mentally, were left with little treatment, and no one listened to the women who were able to communicate their sanity. Nellie would say of her time there that the food was probably the worst part. It was inedible every day. Rotten meat, boiled potatoes, bread hard as rock and black in colour. Then they would have to watch in the evenings as the nurses feasted on a fresh array of fruits and vegetables. The asylum was always cold, the women blew in the hands with only one bath a week. The patients who weren't in a fit state to care for their own hygiene would receive zero help. There was nothing to pass the time apart from sewing the uniforms of future patients. All they could do was sew and stare out the window, and once a week they'd be allowed outside for a walk and go on the merry-go-round. She writes that some of the patients would be egged on and poked until they started to crack, saying, "The attendants seemed to find amusement and pleasure in inciting the violent patients to do their worst. They would be beaten and choked for the workers' entertainment. The women weren't treated as humans, they weren't worthy of humane treatment. There were 16 doctors on the island and only 2 seemed to pay any attention to the patients." She writes, "How can a doctor judge a woman's sanity by merely bidding her good morning and refusing to hear her plea for release?" From beginning to end, Nellie found that the treatment of herself and all the other women was just appalling. There was no treatment. Once you were there, you were insane, and that was it. You were left to fend for yourself. Eventually, Nellie's 10 days were up and it was time for her to leave, only she knew that was going to be a battle in itself. She had spent the last 10 days telling them that she was sane and needed to be released, but the more she told them she was sane, the more they doubted it. She wrote that Blackwell was a human rat trap, easy to get in, but once there, impossible to get out. The only reason that Nellie was able to be released is because her editor, a man, stood by his word and came to claim her so she could be released into his care. She says she felt selfish being able to leave when so many who remained suffered, but she knew that she had to write about her findings if there was ever going to be any change. After 10 days, she was free once again and set about writing her article entitled 10 Days in a Madhouse that the New York World would publish in a 6-part series. It would very quickly make her one of the most famous journalists in the United States. Her main goal upon writing the article after her release was that she could go on to help some of the unfortunate women she left behind, and soon she was summoned to appear before a grand jury who heard her story beginning to end. The jurors requested that she accompany them on a visit to the island, to which she of course consented. But once they arrived, Nellie found a completely different Blackwell to the one she had known. Everything was now clean, the food was of good quality, and none of the women she had met there remained. Even a lot of the staff had changed. Nellie didn't expect the jury to believe her after this, but they did, and they reported back to the court advising that changes be made as suggested by Nellie. She had written that she wanted New York City to invest more money into care for the mentally ill, which they actually did do after this. The fame that this article gave Nellie led to a whole load of opportunities for her. She was able to schedule an exclusive interview with serial killer Lizzie Halliday, and she essentially launched a whole new era of journalism known as stunt journalism, providing opportunities for more women to get into the career. Stunt journalism is basically a form of journalism where one has to take a risk to get a story they wouldn't usually have got otherwise, immersing themselves in a particular world to learn more about it. But Nellie, being Nellie, wasn't about to let the asylum piece be the peak of her career. The next year, in 1888, she suggested to her editor at the New York World that she takes a trip around the world. She'd been inspired by the Jules Verne book Around the World in 80 Days, and she wanted to be the first person to do it for real. But it wasn't only that. Travel at this time was considered to be something that was only suitable for men. It wasn't an activity for women. Women had too many things they needed to take, they would miss out on too many luxuries, and they'd miss their families. Nellie wanted to challenge this and prove that women could travel just as well as men. And she was going to travel light while she did it, taking only the dress she wore, a traveller's cape, and a small bag, representing her commitment to independence and self-reliance. She didn't need anything but herself. It took a long time for her to convince her editor that this was a good idea, but eventually, exactly 1 year after first pitching the idea, Nellie set off on her world trip at 9:40 a.m. on November 14th, 1889. It was very last minute, and she was given only 2 days' notice before she set off. She chose to begin her journey by travelling on the ocean liner SS Augusta Victoria from Hoboken, New Jersey, and out across the Atlantic Ocean towards the UK. Her journey immediately attracted interest from a lot of rival publications, prompting the Cosmopolitan magazine to send their own journalist, Elizabeth Bisland, out on her own journey, piggybacking on the popularity of Nellie's story. Cosmopolitan's goal was for Elizabeth to beat Nellie back. It was to be a race. Elizabeth only had hours to get prepared for her own journey, and it was decided that she would travel in the opposite direction, going west instead of east. Elizabeth left New York at 6 p.m. that night and headed to Chicago, beginning her race, which Nellie had no idea she was participating in. For Nellie, the journey across the Atlantic took 7 days, eventually reaching Southampton here in the UK. She took a train to London, where she then took a train to Folkestone and got a ferry over the Channel to France. In France, she took a detour to meet Jules Verne, the man whose book had inspired her journey. Then she continued heading east, every port she had reached from Egypt to China, all being part of the British Empire, making her journey that bit easier. She made the majority of this part of the journey via ship, meeting people from different cultures along the way. She travelled through the Suez Canal, through Singapore, Hong Kong and Japan, places that most people would never even dream of being able to visit. When she wasn't travelling by steamship, she was travelling by rail. A month and a half into her journey, it became quite clear that this really was becoming a race against time. She hadn't particularly been rushing, she'd been taking her time in each country, getting to know the local customs and the local food. But she now needed to get back across the Pacific if she was going to reach her goal of 80 days. On January 22nd, 1890, she reached San Francisco and now had to travel the length of the country back to her starting point in New Jersey, which she did by train. She reached her goal on January 25th, the train pulling into the station at 3:51 p.m. Nellie Bly's journey across the world had taken 72 days, 6 hours and 11 minutes, beating all other records for round the globe travel. After 25,000 miles, she immediately headed back to New York and straight to her offices where she started writing about her journey. And she did beat Elizabeth Bisland, but it was never really about the race. Both her and Elizabeth became household names, increasing newspaper sales by a lot. But despite how much Nellie's story increased sales, she never received a raise or a bonus from the newspaper for her efforts. So shortly after, she resigned and travelled the USA talking about her experience, giving lectures. Although she did have her stories to tell, her financial situation was not good. She started to write novels, writing 11 novels over the next 6 years, and did eventually return to journalism. Although she was never interested in marriage, in 1895 she did end up marrying a millionaire called Robert Seaman. She was just 31 years old and he was 73. Can you believe that she was only 31 by this point? She had achieved so much with her life. Robert was in very poor health, so Nellie took over the running of his company, the Ironclad Manufacturing Company, which made steel containers. Although she was undeniably a talented writer, running a business was not Nellie's strong point, and the company eventually fell into bankruptcy. But as she always did, she turned it around. By the early 1900s, she had registered patents for many of her own inventions, steel barrels and garbage cans. In 1904, her husband died and eventually business fell away again. In 1914, Nellie was about to travel to Austria to look for fundings to save the business, and then World War I broke out. She had recently picked up the pen again, having been reported on the suffragette movement from 1913, of which she was a very strong supporter, but with the war, she was able to become one of the first female wartime reporters, reporting from the front line. There was nothing that Nellie Bly couldn't do. Towards the end of her life, she fell back into her love of journalism, but sadly on January 27th, 1922, she died of bronchopneumonia at St. Mark's Hospital in New York City, exactly 27 years after she finished her journey around the world. She would be interred at the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, where she remains today. I have loved learning about the life of this awesome woman, and I hope that you have too. She changed the boundaries of what a woman could do, not only in the world of journalism, but in the world in general. Even if she made just one man take women more seriously because of her accomplishments, that was a win. In a world where women were deemed as incapable of complicated thought, supposed to stay at home with the kids and raise them, Nellie Bly proved that they could do anything that men could do, and in some cases, they could do it better. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you've enjoyed learning something new, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.